Are you ready to feel like a super powerful developer? Because we're going to write our first function. And let's be honest, it's actually pretty easy. Now, as I mentioned before, we have lots of experience with runtime functions, which are the functions that are built into GameMaker Studio 2. We've used things like audio play sound, instance create, etc., etc. And so we're going to construct our function the same way. It's called scr_showPrompt. The first thing we need to do, however, is to specify which arguments are going to go into our function. So when we use this later, we know what we need to put in. So for this, we're going to put _object, comma, _x, comma, _y. Now remember, these are temporary variables that we're creating just for this particular function. And what object is going to mean is we want to create a prompt, but we want to create it based on a particular object. So for instance, one of our NPCs. We also want to specify an X and a Y position for that prompt when we pop it up. So that's what those two variables will do. So let's just go ahead and fill this out. I'm going to start with a if statement. So if instance exists _object. And I'm just using parentheses to keep things tidy. I'll use an open curly brace and a closing curly brace. So what are we doing here? Well, a lot of times in programming, you need to be very careful about what you're asking the game to do. For instance, we want to make sure that we are popping up an object based on the position of another object, in this case, our NPCs. But sometimes you have to think ahead. For example, what happens if for some random reason, our NPC, like our baker or grocer or teacher, they just disappear? Maybe there's a bug or something goes wrong and they're no longer in the game or in the town anymore. We use things like if statements to check if something even exists in the first place as a redundant way just to make sure everything's okay. It may seem like we do this a lot, but it's all kind of good practice. So first we're checking to make sure whatever we specify as _object is still there. And then we're going to add another if statement. So I'm going to type if. Again, I'm going to use my parentheses. And this time we're going to check if something does not exist. So we're going to look to see if the text box does not exist. So obj_text box. And I'm going to make sure that a prompt does not also exist because we don't want to have duplicates of all this stuff. And I'm going to use an open curly brace, closing curly brace, and our line should be complete. So we're checking if there is not an instance of object text box and if there is not an instance of object prompt. Next, we're going to create an instance of what we want, which is a prompt, obj_prompt, like we say right there. So let's use the instance create depth function that we've used before. I'll type it in, instance create depth. You can see it's here. And it's got some arguments we need to fill out. So those we will set those arguments as _x, comma, _y, comma, and the next argument is for the depth that we want this thing to appear at. As we've done before, let's just choose a really high depth, one that's very close to the camera. So we'll do -10,000. And then the last argument is what is the instance we're actually trying to create. So I will type in rather obj_prompt. So we need to do one more thing to this line. Every time an instance is created in GameMaker Studio 2, or, for example, placed in a room, that instance has a very specific ID. So as an example, if I go to my room, remember we have all these barrels throughout our town, and you can see in this example, I've got 3 barrels right here. But beside there, you can see that they all have these specific instance IDs. These are very, very specific names that only that instance has. So if I create 1,000 more barrels in the room, each one of those new barrels will have their own instance ID. That way, in the game, you can actually refer to very, very specific objects. barrel number 275, you can look for that one in particular, as opposed to just all barrels. In order to get that instance ID, we need to capture that and store it somewhere. So we've actually done this before. So I'm just going to edit this line and type I equals. And remember what happens when we have a function that's on the right side of an equal sign. It means we're running this function, and then we're storing the result of that function in the variable on the left side of the equal sign. So in this case, instance create depth automatically knows what this specific instance ID of this prompt object is. But unless we capture it, we're not going to find that out. So we're adding this one line just to do that. Let's add one other line and do something we've never done before. Let's type in return I. We'll explain this in the next step, but now we've got our complete show prompt function.